The sun over the cotton farm didn't just shine, it scorched. Yet Choi Hyung-bae stood at the edge of the field, motionless, watching a single woman work. He had been sent here to disappear, but he found himself tethered to a 19-year-old girl who didn't even know his name. Sasha moved through the rows with a rhythmic, grounded grace that made his chest ache with a sudden, unfamiliar heat. Her skin was a deep, velvet ebony that seemed to absorb the light, contrasting beautifully with the bright, dyed curls cropped into a low fade. She was currently arguing with Mr. Henderson, the farm foreman, about the irrigation schedules. Hyung-bae watched the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear, her expression fierce and unrelenting. He had spent his life dealing with men who bowed at the mere sound of his footsteps. But Sasha looked at the foreman, a man twice her age, with a gaze that dared him to challenge her. Hyung-bae started walking toward them, his heavy work boots crunching in the dry earth. He wasn't wearing his usual attire. He was dressed in a worn, sleeveless cotton shirt that clung to his broad shoulders, leaving his arms bare and dusted with field dirt. He had abandoned the city, the suits, and the constant noise, but he hadn't managed to abandon his nature. He still walked like a predator, though he was currently a predator learning how to hold a hoe. "Is there a problem here?" Hyung-bae asked, his voice low and steady. Mr. Henderson glanced at him, looking slightly unnerved by the man who had suddenly appeared in their quiet lives 3 weeks ago. "Just farm business, Choi. Don't worry about it." Sasha turned, her eyes narrowing as she looked him up and down. She wasn't intimidated, she was annoyed. "He thinks the tractor is more important than the manual weeding schedule, Mr. Choi. If you're going to stand there, at least pick up a basket." Hyung-bae felt a sharp, possessive thrill crawl up his spine. She wasn't afraid to speak to him like that. Most people kept their distance, sensing the quiet intensity that radiated off him. But Sasha stood her ground. He stepped into her personal space, noticing the faint scent of shea butter and sun-warmed earth on her skin. It was intoxicating. "I'll help you with the rest of this row," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't move away. He enjoyed the way she stood tall, refusing to blink, even as his presence seemed to swallow the space around them. "Then get to work," she replied, turning back to the plants. Hyung-bae smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that never reached his eyes. He didn't care about the cotton. He only cared that for the next few hours, she was entirely his. The next morning, Sasha found a small velvet-lined box sitting atop her wooden porch steps. Inside lay a diamond necklace that looked entirely out of place in a world of dust and manual labor. When she walked out to the field, Hyung-bae was already there, leaning against the fence, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes tracking her movement with the intensity of a hawk. When she approached, she held the necklace out to him. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Choi. I don't wear things like this to pick cotton." Hyung-bae didn't look at the jewelry. He looked at her collarbone, where the dark skin met the collar of her worn work shirt. "It wasn't a mistake. I saw it in the city and thought it belonged on you." "I don't know who you were before you got here," Sasha said, her voice sharp but laced with curiosity. "But you aren't in the city anymore. Keep your expensive toys for someone who wants them." He stepped closer, his presence effectively cutting her off from the rest of the field hands. He reached out, not to take the necklace, but to tuck a loose strand of her bright hair behind her ear. His fingers were calloused and warm, smelling faintly of the motor oil he'd been using to fix the water pump. He didn't pull away when she stiffened. "I don't want someone else," he murmured, his gaze fixed on her lips. "I want you to have things that are beautiful. Because you are the only beautiful thing on this entire God-forsaken farm." "That's a weird way to show affection," she muttered, though she didn't step back. "It's the only way I know," he admitted. Later that afternoon, the foreman walked by and jokingly placed a hand on Sasha's shoulder to point out a section of the crop that needed extra attention. Before the man could even finish his sentence, Hyungbae was there, his hand firmly, yet casually, gripping the foreman's wrist. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was absolute. "I've got this section," Hyungbae said, his tone perfectly pleasant, though his eyes remained fixed on the foreman's face until the man withdrew his hand and hurried away. Sasha stood there, hands on her hips, watching him. "You're incredibly possessive for a man who just started working here 3 weeks ago." Hyungbae turned his attention back to her, his expression softening just a fraction, though that underlying heat remained. "I know what I want when I see it, Sasha, and I don't like other people touching what's mine." "I'm not yours," she countered, though her heartbeat betrayed her, thumping rhythmically against her ribs. "Not yet," he replied, picking up a basket and holding it open for her. "But I have plenty of time." The afternoon heat was relentless, thick and heavy, until the sky bruised into a deep purple and broke open. The rain didn't just fall. It hammered against the tin roof of the farmhouse, turning the world outside into a blurred gray curtain. Inside, the power flickered and died, leaving them in the dim, humid quiet of the kitchen. Sasha sat at the scarred wooden table, wiping mud from her boots, while Hyungbae stood by the window, watching the deluge. The storm had forced them inside, trapping them in the suffocating proximity of the small house. Every time he moved, the floorboards groaned, and the air between them felt charged, heavy enough to bruise. "You should have left hours ago," Sasha said, breaking the silence. She glanced at him, noting the way he was staring at the front door, as if he could physically hold it shut against the world. He turned, the fading light catching the sharp lines of his face. He didn't look like a farmhand in that moment. The casual mask he wore during the day had slipped, revealing the man who was used to absolute control. "I'm not going anywhere, Sasha." He walked toward her, his movements predatory and silent. When he reached the table, he leaned over it, bracing his weight on his palms so that she was effectively hemmed in by his torso. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his skin, smelling of damp earth and the sharp, clean scent of the soap he used. "Why are you so intense about this?" she asked, her voice dipping lower. "We're just 2 people on a farm. Why do you act like the world is going to end if someone else so much as says good morning to me?" Hyungbae reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch firm and demanding. "Because in my world, things that matter are easily taken if you don't keep them under lock and key. You think this is a game? You think I'm just playing at being a farmer?" He moved closer, his lips hovering inches from hers, his breath hitching as he felt her tremble, not with fear, but with a burgeoning, undeniable tension. "I have spent my whole life making sure I never lost anything I wanted. I'm not about to start failing with you." Sasha looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. She could see the obsession flickering in his pupils, a stark, unblinking hunger. "You're terrifying, Hyungbae," she whispered. "Good," he murmured, his thumb pressing harder against her lower lip. "Then you understand exactly where you stand." The power hummed, sparking back to life for a split second, illuminating the raw, desperate hunger in his gaze before the house plunged back into total darkness. In the sudden blackness, he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, claiming the space he had been circling for weeks. The next morning, the air was still heavy, but the tension had shifted. Hyungbae no longer stood by the fence watching. He was out in the rows, his shirt discarded on a post, his back slick with sweat as he worked with a frantic, punishing energy. He was trying to prove he could handle the life she built, 1 acre at a time. Sasha watched him from the shade of the tractor shed. He was doing the work of 3 men, fueled by a singular, obsessive purpose. He wasn't just working. He was carving his place into her reality, literally digging his heels into the soil of her home. When he finally noticed her, he didn't stop. He walked straight toward her, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto hers with a look that stripped away any pretense of them being mere neighbors. He stopped inches away, his hands coated in the same dark, rich earth Sasha spent her life working. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood there, his presence overwhelming the small space. "I finished the south row," he said, his voice raw. "And I fixed the water line that's been leaking for months. It won't break again." Sasha looked at his hands, then up to his face. There was a desperate sincerity in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You don't have to do that. This isn't a trade, Hyungbae. You don't buy your way into my life with labor." "I'm not buying anything," he countered, stepping into her space, his shadow falling over her. He reached out, his dirt-stained fingers gently grazing her temple, tracing the line of her faded curls. The contrast of the dark soil against her skin was stark, intimate, and entirely consuming. "I'm earning my place. I spent my life taking things, Sasha. This is the first time I've ever wanted to be worthy of something." She felt the weight of his gaze, a possessive, absolute focus that made the rest of the farm fade into insignificance. He wasn't the man from the city anymore. He was a man being hollowed out and rebuilt by the way she looked at him. "You're obsessed," she whispered, though she leaned into his touch. "I am," he agreed, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, his touch slow and reverent. "And I don't plan on being cured." He didn't need to use words to win her. The way he looked at her, as if she were the only stable thing in a chaotic world, was the most powerful tactic he had. Sasha realized then that his obsession wasn't a cage. It was an anchor. And for the first time, she wanted to be held exactly where she was. The sun began to dip, casting long, golden shadows across the porch. Hyungbae stood before Sasha, the wild energy that usually defined his movements, replaced by a deliberate, terrifying stillness. The silence between them was no longer an absence of sound, but a weight. He didn't move toward her with the arrogance of his past. Instead, he dropped to one knee on the wooden planks, his heavy, dirt-caked boots thudding softly. The move was absurd, entirely out of character for a man who commanded shadows. Yet he looked at her with a raw, unshakable gravity. He held out his hand, palm open, offering her nothing but the calloused reality of his labor. "I have nothing to offer you from my old life," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, honest register. "No kingdoms, no control, no power. Only this, my time, my hands, my absolute, unwavering devotion to you." Sasha looked down at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the man who had tried to buy her attention, the man who had jealously guarded her against the world, and finally, the man who had simply stayed to work the dirt alongside her. The possessiveness she had once feared now felt like a shield. She reached out, her fingers interlocking with his. The calluses on his palms against her skin felt like a promise. He stood up, pulling her flesh against him. The connection was immediate, a sudden, dizzying rush that left no room for doubt. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity that bordered on worship. When his lips finally met hers, it was a claim. It was messy, hungry, and entirely devoid of the polished artifice of his past. He kissed her with the same obsession he had used to master the farm, pouring every ounce of his desire into the contact. Sasha felt the world narrow down to the heat of his body and the steady, grounding thrum of his pulse. In the quiet of the farmhouse, surrounded by the fields they had tended together, he wasn't a criminal hiding from his past, and she wasn't just a worker in the sun. They were a singular force. He lifted her easily, his arms firm around her waist, and carried her toward the back door of the house. He didn't look back at the fields, and he didn't look back at the road that led to the city. He walked into the sanctuary they had built, the door clicking shut behind them with a finality that settled deep into the foundation of the house. For the first time in his life, Hyungbae had everything he wanted, and he wasn't letting go. The sun rose over the farm the next morning, but the air felt different, thicker, quieter, and entirely complete. The fields stretched out, vast and still, but for the first time, Hyungbae didn't look at them as a place of refuge. He looked at them as home. He sat on the edge of the porch, watching Sasha emerge from the farmhouse. She looked tired, her curls slightly mussed, yet there was a soft, unburdened smile on her face that he had never seen before. He stood up, crossing the distance between them in 2 long strides, his movements devoid of the sharp, predatory edge that used to define him. He didn't hover, and he didn't watch her with that scrutinizing, possessive glare. He simply reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a way that felt permanent. "I'm not going to the field today," he said, his voice low but steady. Sasha tilted her head, her dark eyes searching his. "The work doesn't stop just because we do." "The work is finished," he replied, and he meant it. He had spent his life fighting for control, only to realize that the only thing worth controlling was the space he shared with her. He had shed his past as surely as he had abandoned his suits and the men he used to command. The city and the violence, they were memories that held no power here. He pulled her closer, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. He wasn't marking her, he was anchoring himself. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his heart. It wasn't the frantic pulse of a man on the run. It was the beat of a man who had finally stopped running. "They won't come looking," he promised, sensing her hesitation. "I left no trail, and I burned every bridge behind me. You don't have to worry about anything outside that fence ever again." Sasha looked up at him, her expression searching. She saw the absolute certainty in his face, the way his eyes remained fixed on her with a singular, undistracted focus that had long ago transitioned from obsession to devotion. There was no room left for fear, no space left for the unknown. They were isolated, but for the first time, she felt entirely safe. He leaned down, pressing a lingering, gentle kiss to her forehead before resting his chin on the top of her head. They stayed like that for a long time, just 2 people standing in the quiet of their own world, the morning light wrapping around them. There was no more waiting for the other shoe to drop, no more questions about the future. They had reached the end of the road, and in the silence of the farm, they had finally found exactly what they were looking for. Everything was settled. Everything was theirs.